Jason Miller stepped into the office, his breath catching in his throat as the door clicked shut behind him. The room felt smaller than it should be, suffocating even, with the faint hum of a fluorescent light overhead. The walls, painted in muted gray tones, seemed to close in on him. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the wall, its hands moving as steadily as the dread creeping up his spine. His pulse raced, every beat echoing in his ears. Across from him sat Jack Mercer, the private investigator he'd hired to unravel the mystery that had been gnawing at his gut for months. Jack's face was a mask, stoic, unreadable. His eyes met Jason's with an intensity that felt like a weight settling on Jason's chest. There was no warmth, no attempt to ease the tension. It was as though Jack had known, from the moment Jason walked in, that the man sitting across from him was already lost. Jason swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "What do you have for me?" he managed to ask, his voice low, tight with an unspoken fear. Jack's lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was something colder, something knowing. Without a word, he slid a thick manila folder across the desk. The file looked deceptively ordinary, but Jason knew better. His hand hesitated before touching it, his fingers brushing the edge, a chill sweeping up his arm. Jason hesitated for a heartbeat longer, his eyes flickering to Jack, then back to the file. It felt heavy in his hands, like the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. He'd been dreading this moment for weeks. What would the file contain? What truths were hidden between those pages? His fingers tightened around the file as he opened it. The smell of paper and ink filled the air, an almost nostalgic scent that did nothing to calm his nerves. As he flipped it open, his eyes were immediately drawn to the first set of photographs, grainy, black and white images of his wife, Laura. The pictures weren't clear, but there was no mistaking the dark shadows of a man standing close to her, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but this wasn't it. The timestamps on the photos showed meetings in dimly lit hotels and secluded corners of the city. Each picture was like a jagged piece of glass, cutting deeper into his chest. Something in him, some dark, gnawing instinct, told him this was only the beginning. Jason's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, the photographs flicking by in a blur. But he couldn't escape the feeling that he was seeing something much darker than an affair. There was a coldness in Laura's eyes in some of the photos, a detachment that he hadn't noticed before. And the man in the shadows, always just out of focus, felt too familiar. He could almost feel him standing there in the room with them, the unspoken connection between them pulsing like a hidden current. His eyes skimmed the cryptic notes scribbled on the edges of the photos, some written in hastily scrawled handwriting, others typed in a precise, deliberate font. "Meet tomorrow 9 p.m., all set. Make sure it's clean, don't leave any trace." The words made his stomach churn. The notes hinted at something that went beyond infidelity, something dangerous, something far more sinister than he could have imagined. Jason's breath hitched as he felt a sickening realization settle in his gut. He wasn't just dealing with a wife who had cheated on him. No, this was something more, a betrayal that ran deeper than he ever thought possible. As he flipped through the file, each page turned like a ticking bomb, ready to explode in his face. There were more photos, More of Laura with the same man, this time in a car. Their faces too close, their gestures too intimate. He couldn't look away, even though a voice inside him screamed to stop. The betrayal, the lies, the secret life she had been leading behind his back. But it didn't stop there. Jason's eyes locked on one particular photo, Laura handing a large sum of money to the man. The note beside it was clear. Make sure it's enough to cover the whole deal. A sickening chill ran through him. This you. Pieces were falling into place, but they painted a picture that was far worse than infidelity. Laura wasn't just having an affair. She was involved in something dangerous, something illegal. His mind reeled. What had she gotten herself into? What had he missed in their life together? The questions were endless, but none of them brought him peace. He had to know more. He had to understand what was really going on before it was too late. Jason's fingers trembled as he turned the final pages of the file. His hands were clammy, his vision blurry as he tried to process what he was seeing. The truth was right there in front of him, and yet he couldn't bring himself to accept it, the reality of it. His wife, the woman he had loved for 12 years, was a stranger to him now. Jack's voice cut through the heavy silence, low and steady. You need to brace yourself, Jason. His words, cold and impersonal, hit Jason harder than anything he'd ever felt. It's not what you think. Jason's heart thudded painfully in his chest as the weight of Jack's words sank in. He couldn't breathe. What do you mean? What's worse than this? He whispered, his voice strained, barely audible. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid another piece of paper across the desk. Jason reached for it, his hand shaking. The document was a set of bank transfers, massive sums of money transferred from their joint account into an anonymous offshore account. The name attached to the account was one that Jason had never seen before. His world tilted, the room spinning around him as the full extent of Laura's betrayal settled in. She hadn't just been sleeping with another man. She'd been planning something with him. Planning to drain him dry, to steal from him, not just financially but emotionally, psychologically. She had been manipulating him every step of the way. Jason felt the cold, hard weight of the truth settle in his chest. He was no longer the man who had been married to Laura. He was someone else now. Someone who had been betrayed beyond repair. She was never really yours, Jack said quietly, almost sympathetically. Jason nodded, his throat tight with unshed tears. No, he whispered. She never was. Jason sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the empty side where Laura once slept. The faint smell of her perfume lingered in the air, but it only made the silence more suffocating. He tried to hold on to the memories of when things were different, when they were happy. He remembered their first date, Laura in that red dress, laughing at something he said, her eyes sparkling with an innocence that seemed too far away now. They had talked late into the night, their conversations flowing effortlessly. He could still hear the sound of her voice, soft and teasing as they dreamed of a future together. She'd spoken about their kids, their house, their life. Everything felt possible back then. But now, the man sitting on the edge of their bed was a stranger to her, and she to him. Their conversations had grown sparse, their shared moments disappearing like smoke. He missed her, the real her. His heart ached for what they once had, even as the emotional void between them grew with each passing day. It was a void he couldn't cross no matter how hard he tried. And deep down, Jason knew the truth. The love they had was dying, maybe already dead. Laura's behavior had changed, and Jason couldn't ignore it anymore. It had started subtly. The way she'd stop answering his calls, the late nights at work that turned into full nights out. When she came home, her eyes avoided his. Her words clipped, defensive. "Where were you?" Jason had asked the first time, his voice laced with a mix of concern and anger. "I was at a work event," she'd said, her voice tight. "You know how it is, but it wasn't just the work events." Jason started noticing the small things, the lies that didn't quite add up. She came home with a perfume that wasn't hers, and there was a new glow in her cheeks, one that didn't come from him anymore. And when he asked her where she'd been when he pressed, her answers became more elusive. "It was just a late meeting, Jason. Why does it matter so much?" Her defensiveness stung. The walls she built were growing taller with each passing day, each unanswered question, and Jason found himself locked outside, unable to get back inside the woman he had once known so well. Jason tried to brush aside his mounting suspicions. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, just a rough patch. But then came the red flags that he couldn't ignore. It started with small things. Laura's phone, always face down, always hidden. When he tried to grab it, she'd pull it away too quickly. Her passwords, once easily shared, were now secrets she kept to herself. He saw messages that didn't make sense, cryptic exchanges between her and someone he didn't recognize. But it wasn't just her phone. There were the financial discrepancies. Jason was careful with their joint account, but lately, he noticed large sums of money disappearing. When he asked Laura about it, she shrugged it off. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice sharp. "It's nothing." But Jason knew better. His trust in her had already started to crumble, and the sinking feeling in his gut told him that what he was seeing wasn't just a coincidence. Something was wrong. Something far worse than he could have imagined was happening right under his nose. Jason could no longer keep the growing tension to himself. He needed someone to talk to, someone who would listen without judgment. He called Lucas, his best friend, and they met for drinks at their usual bar. Jason sat across from Lucas, his hands tight around his glass, unable to look his friend in the eye. He had to say it aloud, even if it meant facing the harsh reality. "I think something's going on with Laura," he confessed, his voice raw. Lucas didn't hesitate. He looked at Jason, his eyes narrowing with concern. "If you think something's off, it probably is," he said, his tone steady but firm. "You're not stupid, man. You know when something's wrong." Jason nodded slowly, his mind racing with the weight of Lucas's words. They hit harder than he expected. Deep down, Jason had known for weeks, maybe even months, that something was wrong. But he hadn't wanted to admit it. Not to himself, not to anyone. Lucas's warning was like a wake-up call, the reality crashing in on him. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. "Do you think she's cheating on me?" Jason asked, his voice a whisper, as though saying the words out loud would make them more real. Lucas didn't answer right away. He just stared at Jason, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet. "I don't know, man, but you need to find out." The words stung, but they also gave Jason the push he needed. He couldn't keep living in this lie. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it would be. The decision was hard. Jason wrestled with guilt and doubt, torn between the fear of uncovering something he couldn't handle and the overwhelming need to know what Laura was hiding. But in the end, the desire for the truth won. He called Jack Mercer, a private investigator with a reputation for digging up the hardest truths. When Jack picked up the phone, Jason's stomach tightened. "I need you to look into something for me," Jason said, his voice low, as though speaking in whispers would make the reality less painful. Jack's voice on the other end was calm, professional. "What are we looking at?" Jason hesitated, unsure of how to phrase it. "I think my wife is hiding something from me. I need you to find out what it is." There was a long pause. Then Jack spoke again. "All right, I'll take the case." Jason felt a cold knot settle in his chest. The decision to hire Jack felt like a line he couldn't uncross. Once Jack started looking into Laura's life, there was no going back. Whatever he uncovered could shatter everything Jason thought he knew about his marriage. As he hung up the phone, Jason sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing. He had taken the first step toward the truth, but what if the truth was too much to bear? What if it destroyed everything? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, and all he could do was wait and pray. Jack Mercer's eyes flicked from the rearview mirror to the street ahead as he followed Laura's car through the city's winding roads. The private investigator had been tailing her for a week now, gathering evidence piece by piece. Each day, more of her life had come unraveled. Before him and Jason's worst fears were slowly taking shape. Laura had started acting strangely weeks ago, and now, the truth was starting to emerge in the cold light of evidence. Jack had captured her meeting a man in a nondescript hotel parking lot, their conversation too hushed for Jack's long-range microphone to catch. She'd entered the hotel with him, her body language tense and distant like a woman caught between guilt and desire. The next day, Laura was spotted withdrawing large sums of money at an ATM. Jack had watched from a distance, his mind working overtime. What was she planning? The withdrawals didn't add up, and Jason had noticed that they'd been living more frugally than usual. Yet here she was, pulling out cash at odd hours, as though preparing for something. Jason, on the other hand, was tormented by guilt. Each piece of evidence Jack gathered gnawed at him. He wanted to trust her, to believe that the love they had was strong enough to survive this. But the pit in his stomach only deepened with every new discovery. "She's hiding something," he muttered to himself, trying to push the paranoia out of his mind. But the more Jack uncovered, the more Jason realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. Jason sat in the dim light of his office, Jack's report in front of him. His fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages, each photograph, each transaction, each message driving him further into the labyrinth of doubt. The guilt was unbearable. He had never imagined his marriage would end up like this. He hadn't wanted to see it, hadn't wanted to know. But the evidence was undeniable. His wife was living a life he knew nothing about, and he was left to piece together fragments of a shattered reality. As he stared at the images of Laura, laughing with a stranger in a hotel lobby, he couldn't stop the questions from swirling in his mind. Was this the woman he married? Was this the woman he loved? Had she ever been that person? Or had he been living a lie all along? The moral cost of what he was doing pressed down on him like a weight. Spying on her felt wrong. Betraying her trust felt like an unforgivable crime, but the truth, however ugly, seemed like the only thing that could bring him peace now. And with each new revelation, his sense of control slipped further away. "Why, Laura?" he whispered, barely recognizing his own voice. "Why would you do this?" Jack had dug deeper, and what he uncovered next made Jason's blood run cold. Laura wasn't just meeting a lover. She was tangled up in something much darker, something dangerous. Jack had followed her one evening to a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, and there, in a dimly lit booth, was Nate Sullivan, a man Jason had heard of in whispers, but never thought would cross paths with his wife. Nate's reputation was a dark one. Criminal ties, shady dealings, and rumors of violence that made Jason's skin crawl. Laura sat with him, her posture rigid, her eyes darting nervously around the room. It was clear from the way they interacted that their relationship was more than casual. Jack caught snippets of their conversation, disjointed, fragmented sentences, but enough to understand the tension in the air. They weren't just lovers. There was something else at play here, something far more sinister. Jack's investigation uncovered more about Nate's dealings, drugs, money laundering, and connections to people who lived in the shadows of the law. Laura wasn't just caught in an affair. She was involved in a criminal web, and Jason was being pulled into it whether he wanted to or not. Jason's mind raced. "What the hell is she doing with him?" he muttered to himself, his heart pounding in his chest. "What kind of person have I been married to all these years?" The evidence against Laura grew darker, and Jason's world began to tilt on its axis. Nate Sullivan wasn't just a lover, he was a criminal, and his hold on Laura was tightening with each passing day. Jason had assumed that Laura's affair was the worst of it. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, she was being manipulated or taken advantage of. But as Jack's investigation continued, it became clear that Laura was no victim. She wasn't just being used by Nate. She was an active participant in his schemes. One night, Jack had caught a conversation between Laura and Nate over the phone. The tension in her voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't fear. It was resolve. She was planning something, and Jason could feel the walls closing in. "She's not just in love with him," Jack said when he reported back to Jason. "She's in deep. And this is bigger than an affair. This is about money. This is about power." Jason's stomach churned. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, was conspiring with a man like Nate Sullivan, and everything he had worked for was at risk. His thoughts were a storm of confusion and rage. "What is she doing, Jack? What have I done to deserve this?" The real shock came when Jack intercepted a series of texts between Laura and Nate. The messages were chilling in their simplicity, a cold calculation that left Jason's hands shaking as he read them. Jason's finances are almost in place, one of the messages read. We can move forward soon. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he pieced together the meaning behind the words. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a calculated attack on his life. Laura wasn't just cheating on him. She was working with Nate to drain his accounts, to destroy everything he had worked for. The revelation hit him like a slap across the face. His wife wasn't just unfaithful, she was actively conspiring to ruin him. The financial theft, the lies, the manipulation. It was all part of a much larger plan, one that Jason had been too blind to see. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair to the ground. His mind raced, his breath shallow. He had been living a lie that had been carefully constructed by the woman he loved. And the truth, the horrifying truth, was more than he could bear. Jason sat in his living room staring blankly at the floor. The weight of the discoveries hit him with a brutal finality. Laura's betrayal had never been just about sex. It was about everything. Her lies, her secret life, the danger she had brought into their home. He thought about their children, their future, the life he had imagined for them. All of it seemed to be slipping away. Like sand through his fingers, Laura had not only betrayed him emotionally and financially, but she had endangered everything they had built together. His mind was torn between disbelief and fury. How could she do this? How could the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, be capable of such treachery? And how deep did the rabbit hole go? Every moment he spent thinking about it only deepened his sense of dread. The more he uncovered, the more he realized he would never be able to look at Laura the same way again. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had given everything to, was a stranger. Jason had a choice to make, but with the truth now fully revealed, nothing would ever be the same again. Jason's heart hammered in his chest as he stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the pile of evidence before him. The photographs, the texts, the financial records, each piece was a dagger in his soul, each piece tearing apart the life he thought he had. His hands were shaking as he held up the pictures, the reality of Laura's betrayal crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "Laura," he said, his voice trembling, "how could you do this?" She stood across the room, her arms crossed, looking at him with an expression that made his blood run cold. There was no remorse, no apology in her eyes, just cold detachment. It was as if the woman he had married was already long gone, replaced by something foreign, something cruel. He pushed the photos toward her, his voice cracking with the weight of his disbelief. "How long has this been going on? All this, these texts, the money, the lies. Tell me, Laura, tell me what this is." Laura's eyes flicked down at the pile of evidence, then back to him. Her lips curled into a thin, almost amused smile. "You were just a means to an end, Jason," she said, her tone icy, matter-of-fact. "I needed you to get what I wanted, and once I had it, I didn't need you anymore." Jason staggered backward, the words hitting him like a physical blow. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had built a life with, had never truly cared for him. She had been playing a game from the start, and he had been nothing more than a pawn. His breath caught in his throat as a wave of anger surged through him. "How could you?" he spat, the betrayal burning in his gut. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Laura didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, her gaze flickering toward the window, as if she was already mentally checked out of the moment, as if this had been nothing more than an inconvenience for her. Jason's world shattered in that instant. He had never been more alone. The air in the room was thick with tension, the silence suffocating. Jason's mind raced as he tried to process what he had just heard, the truth still too much to fully grasp. But before he could say anything more, the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the stillness. Jason froze. His heart skipped a beat. The doorbell rang. Laura didn't move, but Jason felt his pulse quicken as the weight of the situation settled on him like a vice. He knew who it was. Nate Sullivan, the man who had been at the center of Laura's betrayal, the man who had been pulling her strings. A chill ran down Jason's spine as the door opened, and Nate stepped into the room. His tall frame filled the doorway, his cold, calculating gaze falling on Jason with an almost predatory calm. The smug, almost arrogant look on his face was enough to make Jason's stomach churn. "You've done well, Laura," Nate said, his voice smooth and emotionless, like he was discussing a business transaction. "It's all falling into place." Jason's fists clenched at his sides, but he couldn't speak. The full scope of the betrayal was becoming painfully clear, and he was powerless to stop it. Nate's eyes shifted toward Jason, and for a moment, it felt like the air in the room had thickened. "Jason," Nate said, a hint of mockery in his voice, "I'm afraid this is the part where you stop being useful." Laura and Nate exchanged a look, their unspoken communication clear. Jason's blood ran cold as they began to reveal their true plan. "We didn't just want to get rid of you, Jason," Laura said, her voice flat, emotionless. "We wanted everything you had. Your money, your life, everything. We planned this from the start." Jason could barely process her words, the shock of it all making his legs weak. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall as he stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You were never anything more than a stepping stone," Nate added, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to take everything. Your assets, your business, your reputation. When we're done, you'll have nothing. Not even your pride." Jason's mind spun as their words sank in. This wasn't just about love or sex or a simple affair. This was about destruction. They had planned to ruin him, emotionally, financially, and mentally. Tears stung Jason's eyes as the weight of the realization hit him. His wife, the woman he had trusted above all others, had been plotting his downfall for months. She had taken everything he had given her, used him, and now, in a cruel twist of fate, was stealing his life from him. Jason was still reeling from the shock when Nate's voice cut through the fog of his mind, more chilling than ever. "You?" "No, Laura," Nate said casually, glancing at her with a smile that sent shivers down Jason's spine. "We could just make this problem go away permanently. One less person to deal with, no more mess." Jason's blood ran cold. His eyes widened in terror as Nate's suggestion sank in. He wasn't just talking about ruining Jason's life. He was talking about ending it. Permanently. The air in the room grew thick with danger. Jason could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat growing louder, more frantic. His mind screamed at him to do something, to move, to escape. But his body refused to cooperate. The weight of the betrayal had already crushed him, and now it seemed they were going to take his life as well. Laura didn't react immediately. Her eyes flickered from Nate to Jason, a brief flicker of something that could have been hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Jason's voice came out low, barely a whisper. "You're going to kill me?" Nate's smile widened, a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. "If it means getting what we want, then yes. You're just another obstacle." Before Jason could react, Nate lunged at him, a sharp glint of silver flashing in the dim light. Jason's heart stopped as he saw the knife in Nate's hand, its blade gleaming with malicious intent. Instinct kicked in. Jason threw himself backward, narrowly avoiding the blade as Nate swung it with a deadly precision. The sound of the knife slicing through the air was deafening, and Jason scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. "Stay back," Jason shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. But Nate was relentless, his eyes filled with cold fury. He advanced on Jason, his movements swift and precise, each step bringing him closer to his prey. Jason fought back with everything he had, but it was like trying to stop a storm. Nate was too strong, too fast. Jason dodged another swing of the knife, his side grazing the edge, a sharp pain lancing through him, but he kept moving, pushing himself to survive. His mind was a whirlwind of rage, fear, and disbelief. The woman he had loved was standing right there, watching him struggle for his life. She hadn't even moved to stop Nate. In that moment, Jason realized just how much she had truly changed, and how little he meant to her now. Just as it seemed Jason would be overwhelmed, a loud crack split the air. A shot rang out, echoing through the room. Nate froze, his hand faltering as the knife dropped from his grip. He looked down in shock, his eyes wide as the blood began to pool beneath him. Jason stood there breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to see Jack, the private investigator, standing in the doorway, a gun in his hand. Jack's expression was grim, but there was no hesitation in his actions. Laura screamed, the sound ripping through the room as the truth of what had just happened settled in. Jack had saved Jason's life, but in doing so he had exposed the full extent of the betrayal, the plot to destroy him, the conspiracy to ruin everything he had built. Jack took a step forward, his eyes locked on Laura. "It's over," he said, his voice low and steady. "Your game's over." Jason could hardly breathe. The woman he had loved, the life he had fought for, were all gone. But at least he was alive. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Nate's lifeless body lay sprawled across the cold floor, a pool of blood slowly seeping out from the wound that had ended his violent, calculated existence. The sound of the gunshot had echoed in the tense room, a moment of finality that had extinguished the threat looming over Jason. Nate's plans, his ruthless ambition, had come to a bloody halt. Laura stood in the corner of the room, her hands shaking, her face pale. She couldn't look at Jason, not after everything that had unfolded. Her silence spoke volumes, the weight of the situation crushing her. The door swung open, and police officers flooded the scene. Jason didn't say a word as they took Laura into custody, her face a mixture of disbelief and something colder, defeat. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Laura's eyes flickered to Jason for a split second, but there was no apology, no remorse. only coldness. "Laura Sanders," the officer announced, "you are under arrest for suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder." The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. In the days that followed, the headlines screamed across every news outlet. "Scandalous affair turns fatal. Woman arrested in plot to murder husband." The media swarmed the courthouse, desperate to uncover the dirty details of the twisted love triangle that had captivated the public's morbid curiosity. No one could look away. The trial was nothing short of a spectacle. Cameras flashed as Laura, dressed in a somber suit, entered the courtroom, her once pristine reputation now tarnished beyond repair. She had been a symbol of grace and beauty in the community, but now her face was plastered on every front page, her betrayal exposed for the world to see. The media seized every moment. "Woman betrays husband, plots murder with lover," one headline blared. "Lies, manipulation, murder, a true crime love story," another declared. Jason sat in the gallery, his eyes glazed, watching as his private torment was paraded before the world. Every detail of his shattered marriage was dissected under the harsh light of the courtroom, the pain of the past months flooding back in waves. His heart ached, but he felt no relief. Justice had come, but it couldn't erase the trauma, the heartache, or the humiliation. In the courtroom, Laura's defense attorney painted a picture of a woman manipulated, coerced into a life of lies and deception by Nate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the attorney began, his voice smooth and persuasive, "Laura Sanders is not the mastermind behind this crime. She was a victim of Nate Sullivan's manipulation. She was under his control, his threats hanging over her like a sword. She didn't want this. She didn't want to hurt her husband. She was forced into this situation." Laura looked toward the jury, her face a mask of vulnerability. She clasped her hands together, tears brimming in her eyes as she took the stand. "Nate used me," she said, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. "I didn't know what to do. I thought I was in love with him, but I was just lost. He promised me a life, and I believed him. I was foolish, but I didn't know how to get out. I didn't want to hurt Jason. I swear I didn't want any of this." The courtroom fell silent as Laura's words echoed in the room, painting her as a woman caught in the web of a manipulative man. But Jason knew better. The evidence, the texts, the financial transactions, they all told a very different story. Jason's stomach churned as he took the stand, his hands shaking as he looked down at the woman who had once promised to love him forever. He hadn't prepared for this moment, but it was here. He had to speak. "I never saw it coming," Jason began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was my wife, the woman I trusted with everything I had, my heart, my future. She knew me better than anyone, but she betrayed me. She used me." He paused, the weight of his words sinking in. He couldn't look at Laura. It was too painful, too raw. "I gave her everything, and she destroyed me. She didn't just cheat on me. She plotted to take everything I had, my life included. I trusted her and she didn't care. She was only using me to get what she wanted. And when she had it all, she didn't hesitate to throw me away." Jason's voice broke, the pain in his words palpable. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, but it didn't matter. He had to speak the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I never thought I'd be here, he continued, fighting for my life against the woman I loved. But here we are, and I hope the truth sets me free. The trial had dragged on for weeks, but now it was finally over. The jury had deliberated, the verdict was in, and the judge was ready to pass sentence. Laura Sanders, the judge said, his voice stern. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison for your role in the conspiracy to murder your husband, Jason Sanders. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was over. The justice he had been waiting for had finally arrived, but as the gavel fell, it didn't bring the relief he thought it would. 15 years. A small victory, but it didn't change what had happened, what had been stolen from him. The betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak, they were still there, lingering in the back of his mind. As the courtroom emptied, Jason stood alone, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Outside the courtroom, Jack, the private investigator, waited for Jason. He had been by his side through the entire ordeal, watching him struggle to find peace amidst the chaos. You did it, Jason, Jack said, his voice low, almost somber. You got the truth and you got justice. Jason looked at him, the exhaustion evident on his face. I don't feel like I won, he said quietly. It doesn't feel like justice. It just feels empty. Jack's expression softened. He knew this was a battle that couldn't be won in the courtroom. The truth saved your life, he said, but it doesn't make the pain any easier. It never does. Jason nodded, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. The pain of betrayal, the loss of trust, would never leave him. It was a scar that time might heal but never erase, and as he walked away from the trial, he wondered if he'd ever truly find peace again. Jason sat in the silence of his living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. It was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed his life just a few months ago. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the empty space where Laura's belongings once filled the house. The weight of everything that had transpired felt like a physical presence, pressing in on him from all sides. His mind replayed the moments of the past. Every deceitful glance, every lie, the planning that led to Nate's death, and the coldness in Laura's eyes when she'd been arrested. Despite his survival, the cost of knowing the truth was unbearable. The scar of betrayal was deep, and it had carved out parts of him that he feared he'd never get back. What had he done wrong? Jason wondered, as the questions crept into his thoughts. Was it something he missed? Something he failed to see? How had his world gone from love to this? Ruin and confusion? Financially, he was drained, his once thriving business now a shadow of its former self. Emotionally, he felt gutted, the trust he'd placed in Laura now a painful joke. He had loved her truly, and she had what? Destroyed him. Jason clenched his jaw, the bitterness of his thoughts filling him with an anger he could barely control. It was hard to understand, even harder to accept. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers cold, as the weight of survival settled over him. He had survived the betrayal, yes, but at what cost? Jason's thoughts drifted back to the beginning. The early days when everything had seemed so perfect. He recalled their first meeting, the way Laura had smiled at him like he was the only person in the room. They'd had plans, dreams, a future that now felt like a cruel illusion. Was she always this way? Had she been hiding a darker side from him all along? Jason couldn't shake the thought that maybe he'd never known her at all. As he sifted through memories, looking for some hint of what had led to her betrayal, he found nothing. No signs. No clues. Laura had been the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd trusted. The idea that she had been plotting against him for so long, that she had faked every kiss, every touch, left him feeling nauseous. Had Nate changed her? Had his manipulation pushed her into a place so dark that she no longer recognized herself? Or had it always been there, buried beneath a mask of charm and affection? There was no answer, only the unsettling realization that he would never fully understand her, or why she'd done what she had. Trust, once so effortlessly given, was now an alien concept to Jason. The core of his belief in love, loyalty, and human connection had been destroyed in a matter of weeks. How could he have been so blind? How had he not seen the signs? The way Laura had grown distant, the late-night phone calls, the secrecy that had begun to fester in their marriage. Jason's heart ached as he remembered the times when he had been so sure of her love. She had been everything, his partner, his confidant, his best friend. And now, she had been a stranger, a manipulator who had seen him as nothing more than a means to an end. How could she betray him like that? How could she sit beside him for years, sharing their bed, their life, and then turn on him when he least expected it? The weight of it was unbearable. The emotional toll of knowing that the person he had trusted most in the world had plotted his destruction, had wanted him dead, was a wound that would never heal. Jason sat back, staring blankly at the wall, his thoughts swirling with the depth of the deception that had surrounded him. It felt as though his entire life had been a lie, and the truth, now that he had it, was worse than the betrayal itself. The emotional void that had opened inside Jason was something he never imagined he'd feel. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal. It was the hollow ache of losing himself in the process. The person he was before all of this seemed distant, almost unreachable. He had once been secure in the stability of his marriage, in the love they had shared. And now he was a man broken, adrift in a sea of questions that had no answers. He wondered if he would ever feel whole again, if the scars would ever fade. Each day felt like an endless loop of reflection and regret. Why had he ignored the signs? Why had he allowed himself to believe the best in Laura when the truth had been there all along? Jason's thoughts turned inward, to the future that now seemed so uncertain. How would he ever trust again? Would anyone ever be able to make him feel safe? To make him believe in love without suspicion? There was no certainty anymore, no comfort. Just the knowledge that the person he had once trusted with his heart had shattered it, leaving only emptiness in its place. The thought lingered in Jason's mind long after the house had gone quiet, long after he had tried to bury the pain in the back of his thoughts. Sometimes the person you sleep next to is the one who wants you dead. The words echoed through his mind like a chant, a cold, terrifying truth he could never erase. For all the affection, All the years they had shared, Laura had been the one person he had trusted more than anyone in the world, and she had wanted him dead. Jason stood by the window, looking out at the fading light, the city beyond him a distant blur. The idea that she had been plotting against him, right there beside him in their bed while he slept, while he loved her, it was enough to make him feel like he was losing his grip on reality. He couldn't escape it. The knowledge that someone so close, so intimate, could harbor such dark intentions was a wound that would never fully heal. It wasn't just the loss of his marriage, the betrayal. It was the irreversible change in how he saw the world. Jason would never forget the woman who had once held his heart, only to betray him in the most unimaginable way. And now, with the weight of that betrayal pressing down on him, he realized there was no going back. There was only moving forward into a future that no longer held any certainty. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Infidelity Whispers for more amazing content. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.